Hi, I just wanted to go over these testing of the biometric systems one more time just to clarify. Encourage you, whatever, just at the last day before your assignment is due, just to be absolutely certain, because everyone's taken quite a lot of data, and no matter what data you've taken, it can easily be organized to get these figures correct. So just to clarify, I want to make sure everyone's really clear on what each of these things mean. And the first one obviously being the failure to enroll. That's the situation when you're just enrolling people, and some will genuinely fail to enroll a couple of times before they actually do get enrolled, or maybe they just fail completely and their biometric just can't be uploaded to the system. But either way, they're on the system. The failure to enroll is very different than the other two, in that it's kind of just done once, and that's how your data actually gets on the system in the first place. And it's really you. It's genuinely an enrollment, and some will genuinely fail. Now, the second one here, this is the false rejection rate. Obviously, it's when it's really you. If it's really the person, they're being verified, but it's actually rejecting them falsely. So false rejection rate. So we'll go into how to calculate these and do a little example in a minute. But just be clear on the three things that are happening, the three situations, and the final one being the false acceptance rate. And in this situation, this is where you're testing it as the hacker. You're trying to be an imposter. You're attempting to hack the system, and that's the situation of how the FAR is calculated. So failure to enroll being just at the enrollment situation, and in a sense it's kind of separate. It's kind of out there on its own. That's the one that does take the longest to do. You've got to actually enroll the data, and the more enrollments you have, the better. But generally speaking, it will take the longest to do than the rest of them. We'll see that in the example I just do in a minute. That's why I made this video, to let you know that no matter how few enrollments you've done, or how few rejections or attempted authentications you've done yet, you can still gain something from that data to demonstrate at least the calculations of each of these correctly. So we'll leave one aside for a second. Let's move just to two. Two is the false rejection rate. We'll look at that. That's the genuine attempts to verify but just didn't work. And the third one being the false acceptance rate. These are when you're a hacker. Okay, we're going to move on to something slightly different here, which is the same concepts: failure to enroll rate, or false rejection rate, false acceptance rate, and we're going to just do some examples based on exactly what should be calculated here. Now let's just look first at this failure to enroll, and the actual calculation formula is that the failure to enroll is essentially, you take all the genuine enrollment attempts, all attempts to enroll, and divide that into the number of failed enrollments multiplied by 100. So you're only going to have so many attempts at enrolling people, and some of them may fail, but every attempt is included in this bottom number here. And we'll just do a little example right now just to demonstrate that. So let's consider the number of people that we might want to enroll. So let's just imagine we enrolled 100 people, 2, 3, blah blah blah, up to 99 and 100. Okay, so we're gonna, in this example, consider that we've enrolled 100 people. So let's give these people some names. Since it's topical, we'll say we enrolled a Hillary, we enrolled a Donald, and we enrolled a Bernie, and whatever, 100 more people, or whatever, 97 more people. We'll say there's a Ted, and there's a Bob in there as well. Now, basically, when you enroll people, like some of them will fail. So let's imagine that Bernie, there was an extra attempt to enroll him. He didn't just get enrolled the first time. You had to try twice to enroll Bernie. And everyone else, Hillary, Donald, these other 97 people, Ted, Bob, etc., they all got enrolled on the first time, and there was no failures when they were being attempted to enroll. And let's just imagine on the outset here, there's this other person here. Let's just call him this name, Arnie. And let's imagine that he made one attempt to enroll, but just couldn't get on the system, and it was disregarded. Whatever, he never got onto the system. So in this example, what we have is we have 100 people were successfully enrolled. Bernie, who was successfully enrolled, he had to do 2 attempts, and this guy Arnie, he had 1 attempt and just never got enrolled in the system at all. So here's a question for you, is how many attempts at enrollments were there? Well, there was 102 attempts. How many of those attempts failed? You see, because Bernie took an extra enrollment, Arnie had an extra enrollment, it's 102 attempts, but 2 of these had failed. So the failure to enroll rate is calculated based on absolutely all attempts, even those that failed, like this one Arnie, who never even made it onto the system, but that's still included in that bottom number. And Bernie's attempt that failed is also included. For whatever reason, the fingerprints were bad fingerprints, or the facial expression was wrong. It couldn't resolve it as a face or the Harlech feature. It doesn't really matter. This goes for any biometric: face, fingerprints, irises, the whole shebang. It doesn't really matter. And in this example here, 100 were successfully enrolled, but as you can see, Bernie took an extra attempt. Arnie never got on in the first place. So 2 divided by 102 gives us our failure to enroll rate. Now, this becomes what we really would refer to as the training set, because that's what I was talking about in class, and I'll just mention it here. It's often called the training set because these are the data that you've got on the system. It is the hardest one to do. It takes a long time to enroll so many people. And quite frankly, when you're going to do a search, you do need to have a good number of people enrolled, because if you get a false rejection, it's better that you've got a sizable enough set. Now, you don't need to have too many. If you have done 100, great, good for you. But if you haven't, don't fret. You don't necessarily get useless data back if you have fewer than that. So that's basically very important, because it's somewhat different than the other two. And I'm almost going to draw a line here in the sand, because a few questions that I've gotten from people is this idea of threshold. When you're doing the failure to enroll experiment, when you're enrolling everybody, your threshold can be set at whatever number you want. And even if it's set high, well, what you're saying there is that your standard for the enrollments, you only want good quality biometrics, whatever, good quality sample biometrics to be considered as proper enrollments. So these 2 situations, they probably weren't up to that standard. Now, just to be clear, because this is one of the reasons I made this video, is that 1 or 2 people during the week indicated they didn't really understand this concept of threshold. Okay, and I want to be absolutely clear on this here. When you're doing your experiment for the failure to enroll rate, the threshold needs to be consistent. You don't enroll one person at threshold X and then try to enroll another person at a lower threshold or a higher threshold. When you enroll someone, when you're trying to make this calculation, they should all be the same. So if you have done that, which apparently if you have changed the threshold throughout that, just consider those enrollments that are at the same threshold. So I'm sure, for example, you might have at least 2 or 3 that have been done at that same threshold. But, you know, technically speaking, the threshold should be consistent throughout. Okay, that entire thing. So I've used this analogy over here of what a threshold is, like a kind of a glass that's not quite full, but, you know, if it's full to a certain point, well, that's the threshold that we consider a full glass of whatever beverage takes your fancy. And, you know, if it's above that threshold, that's okay. If it's below that threshold, it doesn't make the cut, basically. Now, in the other two calculations, they're very, very important. The false rejection rate and the false acceptance rate. And this is perhaps the most important thing in this entire video, is that when you do your experiment for the false rejection rate, the threshold obviously must be consistent. But when you come to do the false acceptance rate, the actual threshold you used must be the same. Because there's not much point on doing an experiment to determine your false rejection rate and then using a different threshold for the false acceptance rate. That threshold must be exactly the same. And even if when you enrolled people over here, you used a slightly different threshold, maybe a slightly higher one, it doesn't really affect things too much because they're not as related as FRR is related to FAR. When you do the false rejection rate, keep the threshold consistent and use that exact same threshold for the false acceptance rate. Now, if you haven't done that, if you've changed the threshold, you know, for every authentication or for every attempt at circumvention, and you keep changing the threshold just so you can circumvent it, that's not the correct way to approach this. Now, if you have done that, it's obviously likely that you still have certain verifications that are at the same threshold, so you can just kind of filter out. So you just consider those authentications at that same consistent threshold in order to calculate your result. So let's do a little example here again for FRR and FAR to explain this hopefully clearer to you. Now, let's take our same set, because this is the training set. The training set was done. That's the names that are there are Hillary and Donald and Bernie and Ted, Bob, etc. They're on the training set. They've been enrolled. That's the hard part, to get them enrolled and make that calculation of FTE. But once they're enrolled, you know, the other two should be quicker, because you don't have to do necessarily the full set of 100. And this is something, again, that I want you to be clear of. If you've enrolled 100 people, great. You don't have to try to circumvent every single person on that list. So let's take an example here for the false rejection rate. When you're doing the false rejection rate, you want to just determine how many of them get falsely rejected, or they can't be verified. So in this situation, you only need a subset. Okay, so you just need a subset, and we'll take as our subset. We'll take the famous Hillary. We'll take Donald, and we'll take Bernie in the subset. Okay, and we're going to try to basically verify them. That's what's going on for false rejections. False rejection is when, you know, like in the previous picture, but it's really me. It's really me here. It's falsely rejecting me. Now, why would it falsely reject you? It would falsely reject you because your score is below the threshold. You see, that's exactly what a false rejection rate is. It's all the number of genuine scores that were below the threshold. If it's below the threshold, if the score is below the threshold, it will be rejected. And then you divide that by all genuine scores, whether they were rejected or not. If something is below the threshold, that score that gets rejected. So let's say your threshold is like here. You say whatever your whatever number. It doesn't really even matter what the unit is. If that is your threshold, if X is your threshold and your score is below X, well then you're going to get rejected. That's a rejection. Now with the FRR, it's when they're all the genuine scores that are below that threshold. So let's just take in this example again. We have Hillary, Donald, Bernie. I'll change the color here to make it slightly more understandable. So with X being the threshold, and Hillary comes up to be verified, and she gets a score that's higher than the threshold. That's good for her. And she does it 3 times, 2 times, 3 times, whatever. And let's say she does it 5 times. So she was verified 5 times. And they were all successful. All of her scores were above the threshold. Now that's pretty easy to do. Like I said, this is the hard part. To enroll everyone, yeah, that's time consuming. But like to verify Hillary, she just places her fingerprint, or she tries to authenticate her face the 5 times. It can be done quick enough. And when Donald comes up to do his voice or face or fingerprint, he gets a verification. It's above the threshold, so correct. Second one is above the threshold. And let's say his third one was not above the threshold. I don't know why, whatever reason, it wasn't above the threshold. So that's, it's below the threshold. It's one of these below the threshold situations. And you just got to mark it, because it was a genuine score. It was a score, but it was below the X. So whatever value it wasn't quite as high as X. So it's a fail. It's below the threshold, and that's that. Now comes again his next one. He does a 4th verification, 4th attempt to verify, and that's successful. A 5th attempt to verify, and that's successful too. Now let's look at Bernie. Bernie comes up. He's got a bit of trouble. First time, it rejects him. His score was below the threshold that you'd set. This consistent, constant threshold that does not change throughout this entire experiment. It doesn't change. You got to just keep it consistent throughout. The second time, again, it's failed. He doesn't get above the threshold, and he's got another rejection. It's a false rejection, because here we're dealing with the genuine scores, so it's got to be marked though. Then he starts getting lucky, or not lucky, but whatever. Maybe he's putting his whole thumbprint down, or the voice is better quality. He's speaking more clearly, and it's accepted better. And he gets accepted again on 3 occasions when it's attempted. So what have we got here? We have there's 5 attempts for each of them. They've all attempted to be verified 5 times, but poor old Bernie here got rejected twice, and Donald got rejected here once. So out of 15 genuine attempts to be verified, 3 of them, the 2 for Bernie and the 1 for Donald, they were below the threshold. And that's how it's calculated. So the 3 attempts, they were the 3 genuine scores, just unfortunately below the threshold, and we still consider all genuine scores these full 15. And that's how the FRR is calculated. But be absolutely sure that you've kept the threshold consistent throughout that entire process, because if the threshold starts changing, it just creates chaos. If you change the threshold throughout it, the experiment could go on forever. And if you've done that, don't worry, because in doing that, at least there's one thing for sure: you know what a good threshold is, and secondly, you're bound to have a certain amount of data where the threshold is the same. So just pull those out and filter it down to the same, where the threshold is the same. Okay, remember this analogy. Okay, this kind of glass cup of tea or whatever it is considered full only when it's at a certain threshold. Below that threshold, it's not considered anything. Now let's take the final one here, the FAR, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So, if you're still listening, hopefully this will make it even more clear. So FAR, This time we're the imposters. Remember our anonymous looking figure that I tried to draw in the last slide? What we're going to do now is try to be the imposter. Now remember, the threshold needs to be the same threshold that you used for the false rejection rates. If you don't use the same threshold, well, the experiment can't really tell you very much, because you know the false rejection rate at a certain threshold and then the false acceptance rate at that same threshold should let you know that by maybe increasing the threshold gives you a more preferable false acceptance rate, but at that same threshold it potentially would higher the false rejection rate. So that's really what you're trying to gauge from these numbers, not necessarily continue to change the threshold until the thing can be circumvented. You've done that, you've all proven that you can circumvent the fingerprint system, certainly, but we've moved beyond that now. Now what we're doing is we're sort of testing the system for its capacity. And so anyway, let's move on and consider this false acceptance. So this situation, maybe you've got a fake fingerprint for Hillary, you've got a fake fingerprint for Donald, and you've got a fake fingerprint for Bernie. So we're trying to basically get a gauge of what these fake fingerprints will perform like at our chosen threshold that we chose earlier. And we'll just finish the video by talking how to choose this threshold in a minute. But anyway, let's just do the same process again. So Hillary, you know, not the real Hillary, obviously this is the imposter Hillary. You want to get a score, an imposter score, and you know, you don't necessarily even need to keep these exact scores, just whether it was successful or not. So you know, the first attempt to circumvent with the Hillary fingerprint was unsuccessful. Why was it unsuccessful? It was unsuccessful because it didn't quite make the threshold. Okay, maybe it was just slightly below the threshold, so it failed. The next attempt, it's successful. Okay, and let's say the next 3 attempts were all unsuccessful. Okay, so one of Hillary's attempts was actually successful, or one of the fake Hillary, the imposter Hillary attempts was successful. So now let's move on to Donald. Donald, you know, you made a fake fingerprint for Donald, and you tried it 5 times, and none of them met your threshold. The same threshold that you used for the FRR, the rejection rate, same threshold you're using at the FAR, the false acceptance rate. It's consistent throughout. You're not changing it. You're not messing with it. And they all failed at that threshold for Donald. Now, we move to Bernie. Bernie, you try him once, fail, twice, 3 times, fail, 4 times. 5th time, yeah, it's successful. You got his above the threshold. Bernie's whatever fingerprint went well above the threshold on that last attempt. So we have numbers to work with here. What we've got here is we made 15 attempts to be imposter, and 3 of them, sorry, I should say correction, 2 of them only were successful. So that's how we make our calculation. So we made 15 imposter scores. That's this number here, 15 imposter scores. The number of imposter scores that were above that threshold, we only got 2 of them above that threshold. And that's how we calculate it. Now, you may be asking, well, you said get 100 or get yeah, you need to get about 100 enrolled, because remember, the verification is dealing with a subset, and when you're dealing with the false acceptance rate, you're dealing with a subset. So you don't need to make a fake fingerprint for everybody. Just make a fake fingerprint for a small subset. That's why I've taken Hillary, Donald, and Bernie. You may still have 100 people enrolled, but the actual false acceptance rate attempt is just on a subset. You know, you don't have to search for everybody. There may be 100 people on the training set enrolled, but you know, when you're trying to hack a system, you just want to maybe if you can consistently get hack into a small subset of them, that proves the system wrong. Or in this situation, if you can consistently show that a small subset cannot break the system, it proves it right. So another thing that came up with 1 or 2 people was how do you choose the threshold? Well, you choose the threshold before you do any of this. Okay, let me just put this in big, bold highlights here. This threshold thing is chosen before you do anything. Before you begin your 3 experiments for FTE, for FRR and FAR, you should be kind of just dabble with the tool. It doesn't matter what tool you use. This is irrelevant. The tool is irrelevant to this particular discussion here, to this particular video here. The biometric is irrelevant to this particular discussion. If it's fingerprint, face, iris, voice, gait, DNA, it doesn't really matter. The threshold has to be set before you perform your experiment for FTE, for FRR, and for FAR. So, like, the threshold has to be set. Now, it's ideal if you keep it consistent throughout all 3. And how do you choose that threshold? Well, you've just got to dabble with a few enrollments, a few attempts at circumvention, a few, attempts to try and get a false rejection, and gauge what a good threshold would be. Now, that's for this type of project. That's really the only way you can go about it. Now, there is a formal way you can do that, and do a whole experiment for every different threshold, but that would take forever. That would just take too long. The only real kind of expectation here from this particular project is that you just dabble with the tool, try to get a threshold level that you can be kind of confident that you'll get some rejections, but at least your false acceptance rate goes down to a reasonable level. That's the threshold you're looking at. It's not like you've got to particularly say it's 60 or it's 20 or whatever. It just has to be the same threshold throughout the experiment. So throughout the whole false rejection rate experiment, it should be the same threshold. Throughout the whole false acceptance rate experiment, it should be that same threshold again, consistently. In a sense, you can almost get away with this project having a different threshold for the enrollments, because that's just developing your training set. Once the stuff is enrolled, it's enrolled, and you can perform verifications and attempts at circumvention over and over again on that same data. So if you've enrolled 100 people, or if you've enrolled whatever number of people at a particular threshold, great. The project's pretty much done for you at that point, because you can just try a small subset, just like our Hillary, Donald, Bernie, and it's not that long. Even 15 would give you a number. Okay, even 15 attempts at getting a false rejection will give you some number. It'd probably be zero false rejections, but it gives you a number. And the more people you've got enrolled on your system, the more attempts, the more authentications you try to perform, the more verifications you try to perform, the more accurate your numbers will be. Just like when it comes to the time to circumvent. The more attempts to circumvent with your chosen subset, the more accurate your FAR can be. So that's why the numbers, when you look at the magazines or the journals, they talk in the thousands, maybe 3,000 enrollments, or they might talk about 5,000 attempts at circumvention to get their FAR. Of course, you don't need to go anywhere near that type of a number, but you can appreciate that. If you just enroll 2 people and you try to verify each one twice, well, that's not going to give you as accurate if you had more people enrolled and you tried to circumvent them a good few more times, or tried to verify them a good few more times. So I think most people are doing pretty well from what I see, because everyone's done the enrollments, and most people I've talked to have told me that they've got good number of people close to the 100. If you've got 50, you can work with that. If you've got 100, great also. But once those subjects have been enrolled, you can do any number of authentications. So let's just take, for example, if you're doing fingerprints, and the Hillary, Bernie, and Donald, sure, each one of them has 10 fingers. So there's tons of quick verifications that you can do just by placing a finger on the fingerprint reader. So effectively, you can just do 30 attempted verifications just like that, and then you can do those same 30 again. So every person's finger, you attempt to do it twice, you'll end up with 60 and then 90. The number could get very high very quickly. And so if you have add them at the same threshold, just make sure they're at the same threshold. You can do the experiment for false rejection rate quite readily once you've established the enrollment, which is really the hard part. And similarly for the false acceptance rate too. Okay, so okay, I've rambled on a little bit longer here than I thought I wanted to. What's this weird thing coming up from Google Play? Let's just go back to that original diagram. Why is that? Get rid of that. It's an advertisement. This is a free package I'm using here, Whiteboard. That's why it's giving me some weird advertisements there. And I'll just open up the first slide there. Just to recap on this. The reason you're going to this trouble is because you want to just specify, well, how safe is this system from an attempted hacker? How reliable is this system for people who are really me? You don't want that to happen at the airport when it's not you. And just remember that the threshold is the thing that should be set. Okay, threshold. Set the threshold in advance. Dabble in a few attempts before you choose the experiment, and then go right into it. As long as the threshold is consistent between these two things, you'll be doing well. To be honest, like with you, even if you've got a small amount of data, you're most of the way there for grades and having a project done. You do very well in this assignment if you've done this set the threshold consistently and have a reasonable amount of attempts of verification and attempts at circumvention. You don't need to have a fake fingerprint made for everybody, a fake face for everybody. Just take 3 or 4 of them and try to circumvent that same person 10 times or 20 times, whatever. The failure to enroll is the enrollment. That's the one that probably took the longest, but from what I gather, most people have a good number of people enrolled. Okay, so that's it, and I'll try to make a few more of these videos to summarize some other aspects of the course. And best of luck in the assignment demonstrations this week. I'm sure you'll all do well. Just present everything you have. If you spent some time doing some implementations, show me the implementations. We want to see the bits that the story of this project for yourselves, how much you took it to the implementations, and maybe which bits of that implementation you can use or not use, and everything that you've done. And if you've changed, especially particularly those who've made changes to the threshold continuously, for example when they're doing the false acceptance, we want to hear about that, and I want to see the data for it. That's not been wasted time. That can tell you quite a lot of things, especially in terms of what's an actually good threshold. So you did that the formal way rather than just dabbling in it. So there you go. Talk to you during the week, and I'll be available on email anyway if you have any queries about this video. So talk soon. Bye.